Hello! In this video we are going to be looking at the first of three moral theories that you need to know about in the AQA specification. Utilitarianism. And the two main utilitarian philosophers that you need to know about are Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. I will, however, touch briefly on consequentialist ideas put forward by the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus, although he wasn't a utilitarian as such, he was a consequentialist, and also by the preference utilitarian Peter Singer, who is alive and very much still working. So this video will introduce normative ethics, which is the study of theories that tell us what is right and what is wrong. All right? And this is to be contrasted with the study of meta-ethics, which is trying to establish whether or not, for example, there are moral facts or whether or not morality is just a matter of opinion. And that is something that we will look at in subsequent videos, not in this one. All right? The other aim of this video is to briefly outline how utilitarianism stands in relation to other normative ethical theories. So we're talking about the Kantian deontological approach there and Aristotelian virtue ethics. So as I've said, normative ethics is the exploration of what is right and wrong. But what makes an action right? Well, in the case of utilitarianism, as I've said, it's what creates the most aggregate happiness or the most cumulative happiness and at the same time minimises pain. Kant obviously takes a different approach that we'll look at in subsequent videos, and again Aristotle takes a different approach to both utilitarianism and Kant. So moral goodness, according to utilitarians, should be equated with maximum happiness and minimum pain. And the moral worth of an action is determined by its consequences. Right? So in the case of utilitarianism, consequences relating to increasing happiness and minimizing pain. So utilitarianism is a consequentialist theory, but not all consequentialists are utilitarians. Okay? And to explain that idea, I will in a moment just talk a little bit about the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus. Before that, however, a few other things to mention in relation to utilitarianism. It is a theory that emphasises ends over means. In other words, it emphasises the importance of the result of what you do, not the means by which you get to that result. Okay? So you could, for example, justify doing some wrong things, provided that you knew that the outcome would, in the end, create more happiness and minimize pain. All right. So it is, for that reason, it is known as a teleological or consequentialist theory. Teleological, essentially being a purposeful theory. All right. So the purpose is to increase happiness and minimize pain. And as I said at the start, we'll be covering Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and Peter Singer. But I will also talk about Epicurus. Now, Epicurus planted the seeds of utilitarianism, but he wasn't actually a utilitarian, all right? Largely because he thought about pleasure in terms of the individual, all right? So Epicurus is sometimes known as a hedonist. Now, that doesn't mean that he was a party animal, right? He believed in the maximization of individual pleasure, but that wasn't just, doing nice things. It was planning for the long term. It was, for example, keeping yourself in good health. So it wasn't just about immediate happiness. It was about developing long-term health. And interestingly, Epicurus put a great deal of emphasis on mental health. So you could argue that he's a man before his time. He thought that ultimately good mental health would lead to a lifetime of happiness, much more so than just indulging in physical pleasures. But he didn't introduce this idea of aggregate happiness, of cumulative happiness. That distinction falls to Jeremy Bentham. So Epicurus is a consequentialist because he's thinking about the consequences of one's actions and the consequences of one's thinking, but he's not a utilitarian because he's not thinking about cumulative happiness in the same way that Jeremy Bentham did. All right. So there are obviously questions about how plausible utilitarianism actually is. Well, if consequences weren't important, then it would be difficult to see the relationship between what we think of as morality and action. All right. So if, for example, intention was all that mattered, then it would seem that consequences aren't that important. All right. And you may remember, back in your early school days, for example, I'm sure you were told to think about the consequences of your actions. Well, the reason for that is that they were trying to get your teachers or whoever was trying to get you to think about the morality of what you were doing, the ethical dimensions of what you were doing. And to a large part, they focused on consequences. They asked you to look at the consequences of your actions. So it seems as though consequences are essential to our understanding of morality. Utilitarianism is also a particularist theory, okay? And that means that the context of every single situation is important in terms of understanding what is right and wrong. There's no universal law, as there is in Kant, for example, that tells you that you must always act in a particular way. All right? So for utilitarians, it's very important to always look at the situation to discover what the right thing is. So, for example, to contrast utilitarianism with Kant argues that one should never break a promise under any circumstances, right? And we'll come to the reasons why that is in the video on Kant. But a utilitarian would say that under certain circumstances it would be okay to break a promise if the result of that was that a greater happiness was produced and pain was minimized. All right, so it's a particularist theory in the sense that it has to look at a particular situation. And how we calculate, as I've said, what will result in the most happiness and the least pain depends on the context in which we are acting. All right, so the final point to make here is that utilitarianism is not an absolutist theory, unlike the approach taken by Kant, which is absolute. Right? So never break a promise, never lie. As I say, we'll come to why Kant believes that to be the case later on. So we'll just return to Epicurus for a minute. He was the first consequentialist, if you like, but he was not a utilitarian. And the reason he was not a utilitarian is, as I've said, because he didn't focus on cumulative happiness or aggregate happiness, right? And he believed much more that it was down to the individual focusing on the elimination of mental and physical pain. All right? And mental pain, Epicurus realized, could cause mental illnesses such as depression, and that, of course, is problematic in terms of developing your own happiness. All right? As I say, he was sometimes thought of as a hedonist, but the modern term hedonist, meaning sort of party animal, this was not what Epicurus was about, sadly. All right, he didn't advocate a life of partying and debauchery. That he was really focused on long-term pleasure and long-term happiness and contentment, if you like, for the individual. All right, but as I say, he's not a utilitarian because he doesn't look at it from a social point of view, in a social context. So the honour of the invention of utilitarianism goes to Jeremy Bentham, and there he is in his glass case at University College London. Bentham merged the idea of maximising pleasure and minimising pain into cultural and political thought. That was his main aim. And in that aim, he's been quite successful, because if you think about political life these days in Western democracies, much of it is focused on providing as much happiness to the electorate as possible in the hope that they will then re-elect those politicians who have ensured their happiness. All right. So it's a kind of useful theory as well. If you think about the term utility, some of you may have utility rooms in your houses, for example. They are useful rooms. Right? So this is the idea of utilitarianism, is that it's useful. Now, Bentham's motivation was grounded in several areas, but he was very interested in human rights, and he was also obviously behind the emancipation of women, although that tended to have been taken up to a greater extent by John Stuart Mill, who was Bentham's successor in terms of utilitarianism. And all of this, again, was based on his idea that human beings want to avoid pain and maximize pleasure. Right? And the more of that you do, the more right the actions that you carry out. All right, so it was obvious to him that women's suffrage was the morally right thing to do, to grant, to give women the vote, because then 100% of the population were able to vote, of the adult population, as opposed to just 50%. Okay, and that would then create greater happiness. All right. So Bentham developed this principle of utility that you ought to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. And he did admit that sometimes it's necessary to create short-term unhappiness if the overall long-term happiness will be greater. So that's what I meant earlier when I talked about the ends justifying the means. All right, and the principle of utility is closely related to Bentham's famous hedonic calculus, all right, which are 7 concepts that Bentham regarded as criteria for pursuing pleasure and as such moral goodness. So we have to look at the kind of happiness that is created, its intensity, its duration, how long it lasts, its certainty, right? The extent of the happiness, how far you are from that happiness, the remoteness, the richness of the happiness, how deep it runs within you, and its purity. Now, you might think, well, how on earth do you quantify these concepts in terms of applying or trying to come up with moral actions that can be applied to create happiness? And the answer is, of course, that it's quite difficult, especially with things like purity, because, of course, what one regards as pure happiness and so on is highly subjective. It differs from person to person. All right. Intensity, again, well, it might be intense happiness to you, or you might think this particular action would cause intense happiness, but other people have different ideas, and it may not have the same effect. And of course, there's the extent of the happiness that's created. Once again, you can't always know all of the consequences of your actions. There may be some unintended consequences, for example. So, although Bentham produced this calculus to try to help you determine what was going to create greatest aggregate happiness, you can see it's a rich area for a discussion in a 25-mark question, for example, about how applicable in terms of actual practicality this hedonic calculus really is. All right. But Bentham nevertheless claimed that used in the correct proportions, fulfillment of the criteria would yield the best possible outcome. All right, and in the end, a morally good outcome has been achieved if the happiness outweighs the pain. Now, utilitarianism created a good deal of controversy when it first appeared, not least because it did away with absolute moral rules, such as you shouldn't kill or you shouldn't break a promise and so on. And of course, it brought it into conflict with the church and things like the Ten Commandments. So, for example, there are absolute moral rules in Christianity. Some of those, as I say, are set out in the Ten Commandments, others by Jesus later on. And obviously utilitarianism conflicts with this because it says, look, you should do something on the grounds of whether it makes people happy, not just stick to something full stop. Right? So it's not an absolute theory, and that's why it ran into problems with traditional religious thought. All right. So utilitarian rules are not absolute, since there could be circumstances in which not to break a promise or to kill would result in greater unhappiness than happiness. All right. So let's look at some objections to Bentham's utilitarianism now. All right. It could require that we act unjustly for the sake of greater aggregate happiness. So suppose, for example, I was a judge and I knew the person before me in the dock was innocent. But I also know that if I find them guilty, it will make most of the population happy. So according to Bentham's utilitarianism, the right thing for me to do is to find that person guilty, even though I know they're innocent, because it will create greater aggregate happiness. All right. Similarly, if the overall end of utilitarianism is to create maximum happiness in society and minimize pain, then, well, why shouldn't I put a happy drug in the water supply, all right, that would make everyone happy? Well, there doesn't seem to be any reason under Bentham's system why I shouldn't do that. And yet it does seem quite clearly that this is not a particularly moral thing to do. So we can't really say that the judge is acting morally by finding the person guilty when they're in fact innocent, and we can't say that putting a happy drug in the water supply is particularly morally right either. And that's the end of this video. Next video, we will look at utilitarianism as it was developed by John Stuart Mill.